Challenge me and prove that I'm not imagining things. His words reverberated in my mind as I struggled to accept the unfathomable. Thayer, my stepfather, had never spoken to me in such a forceful, unwavering tone before. His steady, piercing gaze, heavy with an unfamiliar intensity, sent shivers down my spine, and I understood his implication all too well, even as I tried to push it aside. Just a few weeks earlier, something had shifted. Thayer's attention toward me had escalated beyond the ordinary concern of a guardian. Initially, it appeared benign, small, thoughtful gifts, casual praise, and occasional invitations to join him in the living room when my mother was away. I dismissed it as kindness. Yet, as the days passed, his behavior grew increasingly ambiguous, laced with an unsettling edge. I still remember the afternoon I wore the short dress he had given me. It was a simple day, my mood light and carefree, as I lounged in the living room while he casually skimmed the newspaper. Then, without warning, he lowered the paper and murmured, "You don't realize how remarkable you are." I managed a faint smile, fully aware of the unsettling undertone in his voice, yet I remained silent. From that moment on, I resolved to watch him more closely, to let his actions speak for the hidden meaning behind his words. That night, the house felt eerily still. My mother had retired early, leaving me alone with Thayer as the hours slipped by. His demeanor sharpened, and he edged closer, his words acquiring an intimate edge. Every phrase, every subtle movement, appeared to test an invisible boundary, a line he was desperate to cross. I sat motionless, my mind a tangle of unease and curiosity. Despite the strangeness of his approach, I found myself oddly intrigued by the challenge of determining how far he would go. I steeled myself to remain calm, waiting for the moment he would finally reveal his true cards. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, as I tracked his every calculated move, the deliberate shift in his chair, the way his hand hovered near mine under the guise of reading. It was abundantly clear. He no longer regarded me as the child I once was, but as someone he could reshape to suit his vision. I knew precisely where this might lead, yet I allowed the encounter to unfold without interference. Then came the moment that changed everything. Later that evening, as we sat together in the living room after dinner, Thayer leaned in. His voice dropped to a low, steady murmur as he repeated, "Turn around and show me that I'm not mistaken." His words hung in the air, stirring within me a mixture of apprehension, uncertainty, and a subtle spark of empowerment. I stared at him, trying to discern if he was sincere or merely testing me once again. Taking a deep breath, I met his gaze evenly. "I know what you're implying," I said calmly, my voice steady even as my heart pounded. I neither raised my voice nor acted rebelliously. My expression remained unreadable. In that charged silence, I knew that every subsequent move would shape the course of our relationship. I had to balance cautious observation with the necessity of staying true to myself. I was not ready to forfeit my independence entirely. As minutes passed, I felt the weight of his words settle over us. Thayer's eyes never left mine, and I sensed he expected a response, a sign that I would either welcome or decline his advances. I chose silence, letting the quiet build until it was almost tangible. Every second felt like an eternity, and I knew that the choices I made in the following moments would be pivotal. I also realized that I had reached a crossroads. If I allowed him to continue in this manner, nothing would ever be the same. Yet, a part of me remained curious about where this intricate game might lead. I resolved not to be a passive bystander in this delicate scenario, but instead to observe, learn his moves, and use my insight to guide the situation, whatever the cost. In that profound silence, I could even hear my own breathing as I weighed my options. I recalled every compliment and every ambiguous gesture of the past few weeks, understanding that the situation was evolving rapidly. Tonight was a turning point, and I could almost sense that what happened next would change everything. I braced myself for an inevitable challenge of wills, knowing that the coming moments would be even more intense. The stakes were high, and the path ahead remained shrouded in uncertainty. I had no idea what his next move would be, but I was certain of one thing: I would not allow him to shape this narrative without clarity. I would wait for the moment when his true intentions were exposed, and I would be ready. The next day, Thayer invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant. I accepted his invitation without hesitation. Later, my mother questioned why I was chosen over her, remarking, "We rarely spend time together with Siren." His casual explanation did little to mask the underlying intent, and I already sensed that today's meeting was far from a simple friendly lunch. The restaurant's atmosphere was modern and efficient, Thayer had reserved a private table in a secluded corner to ensure our conversation remained uninterrupted. Once seated, he ordered an expensive bottle of wine and arranged for discreet service. Every detail was orchestrated with precision, as if designed to create an environment in which nothing would distract from the discussion. Thayer began by discussing practical matters about my future. "You should think more about yourself," he said steadily, maintaining unwavering eye contact. "You have the potential to achieve everything you desire if you focus on your own ambitions." As he spoke, his hand briefly rested on mine, a touch both deliberate and measured. Although his tone was composed, I sensed that his interest in me extended beyond mere concern. I responded with a controlled nod and a slight, non-committal smile. Every word, every gesture, was meticulously planned. Despite his outwardly supportive language, the subtext of his remarks hinted at a personal agenda. The way he touched my hand and the intensity in his gaze confirmed that our interaction was growing increasingly intimate. After our meal, Thayer suggested we continue our conversation with a walk in a nearby park. "Let's get some fresh air," he said. The change in setting felt natural. The formal ambience of the restaurant gave way to the calm, orderly paths of the park. We left the restaurant together and strolled side by side along paved sidewalks, surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and scattered benches. During the walk, our conversation shifted from general topics to more personal matters. After several minutes of quiet companionship, we reached a secluded area near a row of mature trees. There, Thayer stopped and turned to face me directly. "You know, there is something more between us," he stated plainly, his tone firm and unequivocal. I remained silent, choosing not to respond immediately. My silence was a means to gather my thoughts and assess the situation. In that brief pause, I sensed a shift in the balance of our exchange. Up until that moment, Thayer had led the interaction, setting the terms and guiding our conversation. Now, I realized that I might have the opportunity to express my own desires without waiting for his cue. Thayer continued, "Our connection isn't merely about routine or convenience. There's something unique here, something that could redefine our relationship." His words were direct, and his steady tone brooked no negotiation. As he spoke, his hand moved again, briefly touching my arm with purpose. I noted every detail, the warmth of his touch, the unwavering look in his eyes, and understood that he expected me to acknowledge the deeper meaning behind his words. Despite the intensity of the moment, I maintained measured reactions. I asked a few clarifying questions about what he meant by something more, and his responses were plain and sincere. "I see potential for change in both of us," he said simply. "It's not solely about what I want, it's about what you could become if you embraced this opportunity." His answers were pragmatic, devoid of any embellishment. As we resumed our walk, the conversation took on a reflective tone. Thayer spoke about opportunities and potential changes in my life, carefully avoiding overly personal territory. "You have the strength to make significant decisions," he stated, his voice calm and steady. I listened intently, aware that his words were as much about steering my future as they were about deepening our present connection. We passed several park benches where other visitors sat quietly, yet our focus remained entirely on each other. The steady hum of nearby conversation provided a neutral backdrop as I continued to weigh his words. Every sentence he uttered was deliberate, calculated to advance our discussion. I realized that this meeting was not solely about the present moment. It was setting the stage for a future that would force me to confront crucial decisions. At one point, Thayer paused near a fountain, the sound of water setting a rhythmic pace for our conversation. "I believe that if you focus on your ambitions, nothing can hold you back," he said while offering his arm as we navigated a slight incline. I accepted his gesture, not as a sign of submission, but as a practical acknowledgement that our conversation was moving toward matters that would significantly affect my life. Eventually, our walk brought us back toward the park's entrance. By then, the tone had shifted from casual to one imbued with a sense of finality. Thayer's earlier words had established a clear invitation, a chance for our relationship to evolve into something far more consequential. I was left with no doubt that the discussion carried profound implications, even though he had not yet spelled out every detail. "Before parting," Thayer said, "think about what I've said today. There is a real opportunity here for change." His tone was firm yet measured, and I could tell he expected a thoughtful reply in the near future. I simply replied, "I will." And then we separated. Later that day, as I drove home, I replayed every moment of the day, the lunch meeting, the deliberate yet pointed remarks, the walk in the park. It all painted a picture of a man whose interest in me had grown increasingly complex. I understood that the balance of our interaction was shifting and that soon I would face choices capable of redefining my future. That evening, after stepping out of the car with cautious resolve, I realized that today's encounter was merely the beginning of a deeper exploration. Thayer's clear statements and measured gestures had set in motion a series of events that would force me to make important decisions in the coming days. Alone in my room, I reviewed the day's events. The clarity of his words left little ambiguity. Our interaction had crossed a threshold, and the consequences were imminent. I understood that the change between us was deepening and that the next phase of our relationship would challenge everything I thought I knew about boundaries and choice. I prepared for the evening with one thought in mind. The stakes were rising, and I must decide how much I was willing to risk in the days ahead. Thayer began appearing in unexpected places. One morning, as I headed to my regular gym session, I spotted his car parked near the entrance. Puzzled by his sudden presence, I paused inside the gym. Soon, I heard his familiar voice call out, "I was just passing by. You might need a ride." I turned to see him leaning casually against his car, a slight smile playing on his lips. There was a quiet kindness in his eyes that contrasted sharply with the casual tone of his words. I replied with a simple nod and resumed my workout, ever aware that his actions were becoming increasingly deliberate. Later that day, Thayer sent me a message inviting me to his office. "Come by my office. This is only for you, see how I work." Despite knowing that his motives extended beyond mere professional courtesy, I agreed, partly out of genuine interest and partly because I sensed this was his way of pushing our connection forward. I arrived at his office building, a modern structure with large, floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was sleek and meticulously organized, a reflection of his personality and success. Inside, Thayer greeted me at the reception and then led me to his private workspace. He pulled out a chair for me and motioned for me to sit beside him at his desk, where several folders and electronic devices were arranged neatly. "I want you to see the work that drives me," he said, his explanations clear and practical as he detailed his current projects. However, as the minutes passed, the conversation shifted from work to a more personal note. Pointing to a detailed chart on his computer screen, he leaned in closer and lowered his voice. "You're the only one who truly understands me." His words carried an intensity that invited an even closer connection. I listened intently, aware that his comments were designed to bridge the gap between professional admiration and personal interest. I maintained a neutral expression and offered brief, thoughtful remarks. Although I asked a few clarifying questions to ensure that our discussion remained centered on practical matters, I could sense that Thayer was carefully choosing his words to leave a lasting impression. Every action seemed calculated to deepen the connection between us. That evening, after my mother had returned home, I went back to my room only to discover a neatly folded note on my desk. It was short and direct. "We need to talk in private. Don't make me wait." The message was unambiguous, adding a new layer of urgency to our evolving interaction. It was Thayer's way of indicating that he intended to take our connection further. I spent the rest of the evening reflecting on the note and reviewing all the events of the past few days, his unexpected appearances, the measured yet intimate conversation at the gym, and now the invitation to his office that ended with his personal remark. Each moment had built up the intensity, and I realized that his insistence was not only persistent but increasingly constant. His actions were no longer isolated incidents. They were becoming an integral part of my daily life. Despite the clear message in the note, I felt a mix of apprehension and cautious curiosity about what might come next. On one hand, I was startled by the growing frequency of his invitations. On the other, I found myself gradually reassessing my own stance. I began to view his actions as a challenge, a puzzle to be deciphered rather than an outright threat. I knew that my next steps would have significant consequences for the direction of our relationship. The note left me with a decision. Should I confront Thayer's behavior, or allow the situation to continue evolving on its own? My mind raced through the potential outcomes. There was no easy answer. The opportunity for a deeper connection was undeniable, yet so were the risks. Accepting his invitation might mean venturing into areas I had once deemed off-limits. I resolved to take some time to consider my options. The note was a clear indication that Thayer intended to proceed without hesitation, and I knew that the next phase of our interaction would force me to choose between maintaining my distance or embracing a situation that could redefine my future. Before the day ended, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not be caught off guard by his next move. I would scrutinize every word and gesture, ensuring that I retained control over the direction of our relationship. One evening, Thayer invited me to a concert. "It will be unforgettable," he declared. Despite my reservations, and despite my mother's repeated, thoughtful questions about why he spent so much time with me, I agreed to attend. The concert hall was packed, the atmosphere electric, yet my focus remained entirely on Thayer throughout the performance. He appeared slightly nervous, though he did his best to project calm assurance. I observed every subtle shift in his behavior, noting that his mood had shifted from casual to something far more sincere. After the concert ended, we left the venue together and headed to a nearby bar. The change in setting felt natural. In the subdued lighting of the bar, away from the loud echoes of the concert, our conversation took on an unmistakably personal tone. As soon as we settled at a small table in a quiet corner, Thayer leaned forward and said, "You know I am willing to do anything for you." His tone was direct, leaving little room for misinterpretation. At that moment, his hand reached out and touched mine. I recoiled slightly, a brief reaction that masked both my surprise and a quiet acknowledgement of his genuine vulnerability. Trying to keep the situation balanced, I offered a small smile and then said, "I need to understand your intentions more clearly. Why do you always hesitate?" My tone was calm yet probing, intended not to provoke an argument but to prompt honest explanation. Thayer's eyes dropped to the table as he hesitated, then slowly looked up again. In the brief silence between us, filled only by soft background music and quiet murmurs, he finally met my gaze and said softly, "Because I am afraid of losing you." His admission was succinct and plain, with no elaborate declarations, just a simple, vulnerable confession. I noted the slight tremor in his hand and the way he avoided lingering on my eyes, a softness that I had never anticipated from someone who always appeared so resolute. After a moment to process his words, I replied in a measured tone, "I appreciate your honesty, Thayer, but you must understand that I am not someone to be won over by promises alone. I need clarity and consistency." My response was straightforward, leaving little room for further ambiguity. I wanted him to realize that while his confession was sincere, it did not resolve the underlying questions in our evolving relationship or justify the increasing familiarity between us. For several seconds, Thayer remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table as if gathering his thoughts. The tension between us had shifted noticeably. What he had just admitted, and what I had responded, marked a turning point in our interactions. It was evident that our dynamic was transforming from a series of cautious gestures into a conversation about our true feelings. In that quiet moment, as the ambient noise of the bar faded into the background, I recognized that our next steps would have lasting consequences. I finished my drink in silence, letting the weight of our exchange settle. Thayer's next words, or even his silence, would ultimately shape the future of our connection. I knew we had reached a decisive moment, a point at which I needed to decide whether to embrace his persistent invitations to deepen our bond or assert my own boundaries more clearly. The night was far from over, and the decision that lay ahead would ultimately define everything that followed. The next evening, I found myself alone at home once again. I had chosen the tight dress that Thayer always admired, knowing it would capture his attention as I made my way downstairs. I could sense a gentle anticipation in the air. Thayer was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine in hand. His posture was calm, yet his eyes shimmered with a subtle eagerness. When I sat beside him, he broke the silence with a low, measured tone. "Do you know what you do to me?" His hand moved and rested on my shoulder. This time, I did not pull away. I met his gaze directly and replied, "And are you sure you want this?" My words were simple and direct, leaving little room for misunderstanding. Thayer leaned in closer. His presence was warm in the confined space of the living room. I could feel his gentle breath as he whispered, "I can't hold back any longer." His hand slid slowly down from my shoulder toward my waist. The room was quiet except for the steady sound of our breathing, and every movement was deliberate, the intensity between us unmistakable. For a moment, I allowed him to continue, to revel in the closeness of his touch, yet at the very last second, I pulled back. "Thayer, you have to prove that I can trust you," I said firmly, locking eyes with him. My tone was even and determined. His expression shifted instantly. Surprise and uncertainty replaced the ease he had shown moments before. He paused, searching for the right words to explain himself, when suddenly the sound of the door opening shattered the quiet. My mother stood in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and concern. "What's going on here?" she exclaimed, her voice rising in alarm. Thayer began to stammer an explanation, his words stumbling as he tried to justify his actions. I raised my glass of wine, holding it steadily as I addressed him. "Thayer, I thought you were stronger." My voice was clear and unwavering, not meant to be harsh, but carrying a weight that brooked no further excuses. The concern in my mother's eyes grew, and without another word, she stepped forward, her presence firm, as she promptly escorted Thayer out of the house. That very night, the door closed behind him, and the ensuing quiet was filled with the unspoken promise of change. I stood there for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. The conversation had ended abruptly, leaving behind a mixture of relief and uncertainty. I felt a sense of empowerment, as if I had reclaimed control over a situation that had spiraled unpredictably. I had navigated the challenge until the very end, and now, with Thayer gone, it seemed that a new balance had been established. Yet, even in that moment of apparent resolution, the gravity of the situation pressed in. I knew that the decisions I had made in that instant would have lasting consequences. The dynamic between us had been complicated for so long, and now the final act had unfolded in a manner that left no room for retreat. I sat back on the sofa, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of everything. The tense lunch meeting, the walk in the park, the private conversation in his office. Every encounter had built up to this moment. His persistent attempts to direct our interactions were now revealed for what they were, a meticulously controlled dance, one in which he sought to set the pace. As the living room fell quiet once more, I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the cool liquid ground me in the present. The room was silent, save for the distant murmur of the night outside and my mother's fading footsteps down the hall. I was left alone with my thoughts, forced to examine not only Thayer's intentions but also my own hopes and reservations. I had long suspected that his interest was never purely about support or admiration. There was always a personal cost attached to every interaction, a cost I was unwilling to pay without clear proof of trust and mutual respect. I recalled the earlier moments of the evening, the hesitance in his touch, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke. I had seen enough to know that if I allowed this situation to continue without genuine commitment, I might lose sight of who I truly was. Tonight had been a moment of clarity. My decision to step back and insist on earning trust was a stand I had to take. With one final look around the now quiet living room, I set my glass down and made a decision. I would no longer be guided by empty assurances or half measures. I resolved to take charge of my future, even if that meant confronting difficult truths and making hard choices about the relationships that defined my life. The stakes had never been higher, and the next steps would require every ounce of strength and clarity I possessed. I would wait for the outcomes, prepare for the inevitable conversations, and, most importantly, ensure that my own needs and boundaries were respected above all else. As the night wore on, I sat alone, fully aware that the true turning point in our connection had only just begun. The delicate dance had shifted irrevocably, and its consequences would ripple through every aspect of my life in the days to come. With a steady breath and unwavering resolve, I braced myself for whatever might follow, certain at last that I had reclaimed the power that was always rightfully mine.